Except my title, I am Michael Scroggins, and I've written down a lot of labels here while I was sitting listening to the panel. I wrote down carefree anthropologist and scratched that off, action-oriented and scratched that off, and then I wrote applied curious and scratched that off too. Finally, I'm going with laboratory adverse. My paper is called Bluntly, It Was None of Our Business, The Roots of and Reactions to Applied Anthropology. I'm going to start with a question I found posed on the Anthropology subreddit the other day. The question is titled, Is Anthropology Bullshit? And the question goes, I have taken a few anthropology courses and found them very interesting. In fact, those are probably the only academic courses I have ever taken which actually changed the way I think about the world day to day. But Reddit, what do you think? Is it just an interesting field with no practical implications or significance, or does it actually have merit? This paper is an attempt to answer that question, albeit in a very roundabout way. You can think of it as a series of footnotes to the topic, to the question, is anthropology bullshit? Now, the common sense definition of applied anthropology, as determined by the Google search, what is applied anthropology, is a riff on John Van Willingen's zinger that applied anthropology is anthropology put to use. But Van Willingen might as well have written applied anthropology is anthropology without the bullshit, right? That zinger, anthropology put to use, along with his other objection, there are no anthropological problems, only client problems, stings. For two reasons. First, it plays on the old cliche of the academic as an out-of-touch theorist. This stings because it's partially true. The second reason it stings, though, is because it uses humor to obscure a dangerous relationship. Now, a close reading of the opening editorial in the journal Applied Anthropology, that was the original title of the SFAA journal, reveals that Ahrensberg and Chappell, they're the founders of the SFAA, primary concern in founding the organizations and the accompanied journal was not with practical problems outside academia that anthropology might be applied to, but rather with how the application of anthropological theory to the then emerging discipline of human relations might broaden the narrow intellectual underpinnings of that field by providing a unifying center around which a science of human relations can grow. In an interview from the SFAA Oral History Project, John W. Bennett explains some of the origins of this term. He says, see, here was the thing. The ultimate disciplinary origins of applied anthropology were in the Harvard Business School. Now, what was going on in the business school to warrant this? Well, you had a number of people at the business school, Eliot Chappell and this guy Roethlisberger and Dixon and other people who were enamored with social science. They felt that business and economics should have a sociological or social dimension. This was their point of view, and this was expounded in a whole series of books and research monographs. These are the Hawthorne studies by the people at the Harvard Business School. It didn't necessarily mean what you and I would have called anthropology, the study of tribal people. I will first, I'm going to move to discuss Boasian anthropology and talk about why it is not the study of tribal people. Then I'll turn to discuss human relations before ending with Saul Tax's reaction to applied anthropology. That Boas came to Columbia via the Baffin Islands is part of the founding myth of American anthropology, and Dan and Bruce are going to talk about that next, so I won't go into any details about Boas at Columbia or what anthropology at Columbia might have looked like prior to Boas. What I want to emphasize here is the other side of this founding myth, what Boas left. And the place Boas left was a comfortable laboratory at the University of Kiel where he was studying the perception of seawater color. And now, at the end of the 19th century, science was undergoing intense transformation. The field scientists and natural historians were headed into the laboratory for a very simple reason. The lab had become, with the mid-19th century success of the synthetic chemistry program, the place where the truths of science are enunciated in the full Foucauldian manner. While scientists of all sorts were rushing into the laboratory, Boas leaves for the Baffin Islands. He moves from the center of science to the periphery, both literally and figuratively. Now, he isn't left behind in a race to formalize the field sciences, as Marvin Harris once argued in a Whiggish and damaging take on the history of anthropology. Boas left the comforts of the lab in Kiel and traded the physics he practiced there for his boyhood love, geography, for an entirely different reason. Boas leaves because the laboratory is disabling in an important sense. The artifice of the laboratory and the position of total control assumed by the experimenter, these two things which form the very common sense of the laboratory and the core of its power, prevent the experimenter from noticing the relationship between perception and measurement, or, to recall our Redditor questioner, how one thinks about the world and the practical implications of one's work. What is profound about Boasian anthropology is not a relativist or particularist orientation, but rather an aesthetic orientation addressing what is sensed and thus rendered visible, and what remains unsensed and is thus rendered invisible. As Boas wrote in On Alternating Sounds, new sensations are apperceived by means of similar sensations that form part of our knowledge. So beware of how you conceive of the world. Hence, in my reading of the foundational myth of American anthropology, and I feel free to speculate here at TC in a way I might not across the street in the Boas seminar room, where they seem to have it all worked out. Anthropologists are not interested in a particular kind of people, rural, pre-industrial, or a certain method, ethnography. In my reading, anthropologists are simply the people who left the laboratory behind. Now, in applied anthropology, the figure of Boas is matched against another founding figure, Beardsley Rummel. Do you all know Beardsley Rummel? No. No. And some of you call yourself, oh, never mind, okay. I should leave that there, okay. Like Boas, Rummel was a program builder. Unlike Boas, the human relations program Rummel built was confluent with the prevailing assumptions of industrialist policymakers and university trustees. Subsequently, Rummel found employment at the tender and unwise age of 27, steering a succession of granting agencies. As Rebecca Lemov notes in The World is Laboratory, Rummel was undaunted by the social sciences, whose subject he found resistant to experiment and therefore sure knowledge. He wrote of social science that it is extraordinarily difficult to deal with. It cannot be brought into the laboratory. Elemental phases are almost impossible to isolate. Now here, Rummel faced a choice, perhaps one informed by his tender and unwise age of 27. He could decide that the human and physical sciences require different approaches, but he did no such thing. He concluded, therefore, the possibilities of social experimentation are to be kept constantly in mind, and opportunities for practical demonstrations, i.e. experiments, are to be utilized whenever they promise to throw light on tentative findings. In Rummel's vision, if the social world could not be shrunk to fit the laboratory would have to expand to fit the world. Now, from his position at the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Trust, where Rummel changed the granting program from one of medical research to social science, and the Social Science Research Council, Rummel built, through his innovation, the multi-year block grant, a program in quantitative social science, such as measuring human relations, right? And Ahrensberg and Chappell write a book called Measuring Human Relations, a program which would have both practical implications and leave unchanged the way his benefactors and beneficiaries thought about the world. He issued block grants to Chicago, Harvard, Columbia, and the LSE, among others, and funded scholars such as Malinowski, Elton Mayo, Robert Park, E. Franklin Fraser, and Herskovits. Also funded the Yale Institute of Human Relations, and therefore all the things that flowed from it. I'm thinking here of George Murdoch and his cross-cultural survey of Micronesia, which they conducted for the U.S. Navy, and which Schneider worked on, I believe, along with many other researchers and institutions. But the key topics Rummel funded with multi-year block grants were studies of child development and industrial relations. And there was a good reason that these two topics were at the top of the agenda, and the reason's name was John D. Rockefeller. The background against which Rummel formulated his vision of the social sciences flowed directly from Rockefeller's experience with the Ludlow Massacre of 1914 and the increasing discontent and violence of the American worker. This was, after all, the era of Wobblies with their one big union and the very zenith of socialism in America. This was the first Red Scare, unlike '68, which was one of the third or fourth, depending on how you count. Human relations, a field perhaps best exemplified by the Western Electric Hawthorne studies, was on the one hand a reaction against the failures of Taylorism, and Rummel shunned Taylorist research on several occasions and essentially dried up the funding for Taylorism. And on the other, a utopian attempt to demonstrate that industry could be a context for meaningful human relationships and alleviate the need for unionism, socialism, and other critical social movements. And this is why adjustment was such an important idea. The reaction to applied anthropology, with its clear emphasis on social engineering, came quickly after the Second World War. The most powerful but often overlooked broadside was fired by Saul Tax. Tax's broadside was aimed directly at applied anthropology's involvement with the human relations program, but this is important, not at anthropological involvement in practical affairs, which Tax regarded as both necessary and inevitable. Returning to Bennett's oral history interview, he says of tax. I don't know whether Tax, was president of the society. He probably was, but he was always in favor of applied anthropology in some fashion or another. The problem was that Saul didn't like the applied anthropologists, and the reason was very simple. It was, again, this heritage from the business school and other things that suggested to him that applied anthropology was really very reactionary, politically and economically reactionary. To distinguish his program from applied anthropology, Tax gave it the name action anthropology. Action anthropology, like applied anthropology, was a reaction to the changing circumstances is one of looking inwards towards industrial societies and its problems, of facing the Great Depression and the results of the Second World War, and also looking at the deep and persistent inequalities in American life. But action anthropology yields very different practical implications than applied anthropology. In a 58 address given at the University of Michigan, Tax said of action anthropology, "We think our philosophy of science is quite within the major historical tradition of the discipline. Anthropology has its roots in natural history." And here, in 1958, Tax echoes what Kroeber said at the 1954 Stanford Conference on Anthropology and Education about natural history in anthropology and the late additions of social science to it. Like geology, biology, and the like. Further along he continues, "We are in general disturbed by the means-end formulation. In this we recall John Dewey, doubtless. The end cannot justify the means for us, and science cannot justify anything. Action anthropology has two coordinate goals. The action anthropologist has two coordinate goals. He wants to help a group of people solve a problem, and he wants to learn something." Returning to the title of this paper, the quote in the title is from Tax, and he's referring directly to the question of whether he should attempt to convince the Fox people to adjust or assimilate. His reply on what the Fox people should do, he replies, "Bluntly, it was none of our business." This is a reminder that the aesthetic dimension which permeates Boasian, the Boasian approach to knowledge production is also at play in deciding which actions to take. Remember, Tax implores us, what is none of our business? Adjusting industrial workers to the tool, mining the political leanings of Facebook users, or measuring the engagement of school children in their lessons at the expense of their daydreams. And space must be allowed for all of us to change the way we think about the world. And this is both a meritorious and significant habit of mind and deed. Now, the problem with writing a history of any kind is how easy it is to treat the past as a series of missteps and the present as a period of enlightenment. But we don't live in an enlightened period. This is a okay. Maybe I didn't need to say that. Okay, you feel it, right? Okay. This is a critical point for anthropology, as the human relations approach did not go away with Daniel Bell's critique of the program as cow sociology. It has reappeared in the guise of lean management, data-driven results, and audit culture, which is increasingly at play in the university, including this one, which is all the more reason to remember alternate programs. Applied anthropology need not be the measure of our engagement in the world. Thank you. It's an attempt to answer that question, albeit in a very roundabout way. You can think of it as a series of footnotes to the topic, to the question, is anthropology bullshit? Now, the common sense definition of applied anthropology, as determined by the Google search, what is applied anthropology, is a riff on John Van Willingen's zinger that applied anthropology is anthropology put to use. But Van Willingen might as well have written applied anthropology is anthropology without the bullshit, right? That zinger, anthropology, was on the Anthropology subreddit the other day. The question is titled, "Is Anthropology Bullshit?" And the question goes, "I have taken a few anthropology courses and found them very interesting. In fact, those are probably the only academic courses I have ever taken which actually changed the way I think about the world day to day. But Reddit, what do you think? Is it just an interesting field with no practical implications or significance, or does it actually have merit?" This paper is founders of the SFAA. Primary concern in founding the organizations and the accompanying journal was not with practical problems outside academia that anthropology might be applied to, but rather with how the application of anthropological theory to the then emerging discipline of human relations might broaden the narrow intellectual underpinnings of that field by providing a unifying center around which a science of human relations can grow. In an Like I said, my title, I am Michael Scroggins, and I've written down a lot of labels here while I was sitting listening to the panel. I wrote down carefree anthropologist and scratched that off, action-oriented and scratched that off, and then I wrote applied curious and scratched that off too. Finally, I'm going with laboratory adverse. My paper is called Bluntly, It Was None of Our Business, The Roots of and Reactions to Applied Anthropology. I'm going to start with a question I found Poe put to use, along with his other objection: there are no anthropological problems, only client problems, stings. For two reasons. First, it plays on the old cliche of the academic as an out-of-touch theorist. This stings because it's partially true. The second reason it stings, though, is because it uses humor to obscure a dangerous relationship. Now, a close reading of the opening editorial in the journal Applied Anthropology, that was the original title of the SFAA journal, reveals that Ahrensberg and Chappell, they're the